to make it interesting to males. And our mood ratings are such that you first do a positive mood rating, and if you're 50% or above, that's it for your mood rating. It's only if you're lower than that that you go to sad mood ratings. And we want to make sure there's safe social connecting, so there's a circle of trust. And that's basically it. You can certainly connect with us to have more information, and we're looking forward to being tested soon in universities. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Emily Colvin. So today I'm going to talk to you all about crossover youth, focusing a little bit on the role of mental health challenges and trauma and how that influences their trajectory to the justice system. So I'll pull some on past research, but I'll also pull on some research I completed at Western University during my master's, and that was completed at the London Family Court Clinic. So what is a crossover youth? There's many different definitions out in the research world and the literature depending on what you're using, but for today's purposes, a crossover youth refers to someone who has previous or current child welfare involvement and they become involved with the justice system. They may be receiving services concurrently or consecutively from one another. And it's quite hard to determine the actual extent of children in care who enter into the justice system. But some studies have found roughly about 1/3 of children in care later have involvement with the justice system. And of youth in care in British Columbia, it was found that 41% were recommended for charges by the police. And that's compared to 6% of youth who did not have child welfare involvement. Furthermore, 1 in 6 were sentenced to custody or detained, and that's compared to less than 1 in 50 of the general youth population without being in care. So what contributes to a youth in care entering into the justice system? It's not that being in care causes one to go over, but there are some factors unique to being in care that do increase the risk, such as multiple placement moves. There are also certain experiences that are characteristic of living in a facility that also increase risk. So if you have a youth living in a group home and they experience challenge with emotion regulation, potentially there is an incident and restraints are attempted to be used. And now the youth pushes a group home worker. But because of the policies that are in place, the police are charged. And now this youth has an assault charge. Would that necessarily happen if they lived at home with their parents or with their other relatives? It kind of reflects an institutional response to adolescent misbehavior. Another explanation is that there are a portion of children in care who enter in the justice system that their risk profiles are very similar to other kids who enter into the justice system. 2 of those risk factors being child maltreatment and mental health problems, which is the focus of my talk today and my research completed at Western University. So one of the things that I was hoping to look at was the development of post-traumatic stress disorder following early experiences of interpersonal trauma for crossover youth. Also giving attention to the relationship they have with comorbid mental health challenges and the nature of the abuse experiences. As I mentioned, this was completed at the London Family Court Clinic with 299 young offenders who were referred for Section 34 assessment from 2010 to 2016. And it was found that 84.3% of these youth had either current or previous child welfare involvement, rendering them the designation of a crossover youth. So when I think of some of my main findings or what I want to convey to everyone here today, I can think of 3. So there's such a high prevalence of mental health problems for crossover youth. It was found that nearly 80% had at least one diagnosed mental health child disorder, and that ranged all the way up to 10 for a few youth. But we also know that there's sometimes an underreporting, potentially because someone doesn't have access to receive a formalized assessment in order to get a diagnosis, even though that their symptoms are at that threshold. So I also looked at symptoms, and it was found that over 95% had symptoms that were consistent with at least one mental health disorder. A second main takeaway is that the characteristics of their maltreatment experiences is very critical. I did find that sexual abuse and experiencing multiple forms of abuse, so sexual with neglect or physical, was able to predict the development of PTSD and post-traumatic stress symptoms above and beyond other known risk factors such as gender, substance use, or other comorbid mental health challenges. And a third is that some of the mental health problems that we see, or maybe externalizing and internalizing behaviors, are actually just masking the effects of other disorders related to their early trauma experiences. So why is understanding or recognizing trauma important? Well, this all was happening in childhood, and that's a really important period of development when someone is still developing psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally as well. And then so the impacts of trauma can actually change brain structure, leading to compromised cognitive and psychosocial outcomes. Some of these being in the areas of emotional and behavioral regulation, attachment, psychopathology, and social development. So when we think of someone in care who ends up entering into the justice system, although there's other factors playing, potentially like mental health as well, it's sometimes believed that it's these early experiences of childhood maltreatment that really influence their entrance into both systems. So we see that could happen through family breakdown and someone ends up entering into the child welfare system. But it's the same experience of interpersonal trauma that also leads to certain acting out behaviors, later propelling them into the youth justice system. And when we think about the early experiences of trauma and the high rates of these for children and youth, especially those entering the justice system, are these experiences recognized when we see them? So if you think of someone who was physically abused, how do they experience being restrained? Or what about someone who experienced neglect? How do they experience seclusion? Unfortunately, some of the practices we currently have re-traumatize the children and youth that we see. And these agencies are actually supposed to help them heal from trauma, not provide them with triggers to impede this process. So one thing that I've noted through my research and countless others is the utilization of trauma-informed care, which I know has come up several times today. And this really needs a paradigm shift from looking at a kid with what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And this really allows us to see what the underlying need is of certain behaviors. And so trauma-informed care has been a best practice in order to deal with someone who's experienced trauma. But what is that? So this is more of a organizational framework and treatment framework that understands, recognizes, and responds to the effects of all types of trauma, while also avoiding to re-traumatize them. And there are 5 pillars of trauma-informed care, including safety, transparency and trustworthiness, choice, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment. But just like other theories and frameworks, sometimes we do have challenges actually translating this into practice. And especially when the guiding principles are quite wide-ranging and encompassing as those that I just mentioned. So a goal that we should have as all different agencies that work with children and youth is to develop certain programs that incorporate trauma-informed care and these pillars, but also respecting other people's operationalization of these pillars and trauma-informed care while also being on the same page. So there is a new initiative that we're working with the London Family Court Clinic, stemming from the project Joyce Radford just talked about, to deliver trauma-informed practices into the community. And one way we're doing this is providing trauma-informed care through dialectical behavioral therapy for at-risk youth. So DBT is sort of a form of stabilization, and it really helps the youth seen at the court clinic because it helps them develop skills that may have never been developed so far. So it offers training and skills in the areas of mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. So the way the DBT program is happening at the London Family Court Clinic is there's 3 main parts to it. So there's a DBT group component, an individual skills training component, and then individual counseling as well. And these happen weekly for the 10-week program. So it's really our hope that through providing trauma-informed care, evidence-based practice, and collaboration with various agencies serving vulnerable youth, that we not only improve the level of care we're providing, but we also help increase their resiliency and help them recover from trauma. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Harris, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about a collaboration that the London Family Court Clinic undertook with our Indigenous partners. I am speaking on behalf of Sue Dockstader, who was supposed to be doing this presentation. She was our Director of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit and Diversity Services, but she has moved on to take up the leadership of the Ogwedeni Dow, which is the Child and Family Services on Six Nations. So she wasn't able to be here today, but I am stepping in with humility to provide you with some information. So my colleague and friend Sue used to use this slide to talk about the foundation from which we undertook collaboration with our First Nations partners. And she conceptualized it as a two-row wampum, which she felt teaches about collaboration. So I'm going to share this with you today with permission. She felt that collaboration exists on the parallel rows of the wampum, with mainstream and Indigenous practitioners each bringing forth their knowledge, but at the same time recognizing that the two systems are not the same and the needs of the two systems are not the same. So the idea is that we work as respected allies with the end goal of social transformation. Sue had many projects at the clinic, so I'm going to talk about one that she worked on with me, which is to improve our Indigenous youth justice assessments. And Haley referenced Section 34 of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, those assessments in particular. So why would we undertake this collaboration? The major reason is that there are an enormous number of barriers for the First Nations young people that were coming through the clinic. And what we learned through the collaboration is that it's very important to call out some of those barriers and not just to talk in generalities, but to talk about the specific barriers that each specific young person experienced. So I'll give you one example of a young boy who was from a very remote Indigenous community who had English as a second language but found themselves in our community and in the justice system. So we had developed a wellness plan for this young person through a Section 34 assessment. So in justice speak, it would be a rehabilitation plan, which included education of the young person in their original language. And we actually happen to have a local speaker of that original language in our community. So when we presented the information and court was done, the case managers for this young person explained that it was very unlikely the young person was going to be returning to their community in the near future, and thus English should be prioritized over the learning of their original language. And so they would be put in an English school and learning English, and there wasn't much need for the original language until maybe later on if they decided to reconnect. And I think from listening to a lot of the talks today, you can see how over the long term that would contribute to their disconnection. It would be very hard for them to return to their community where many members spoke the original language of that young person. How would they communicate? How would they share in the cultural and family community knowledge that they need for wellness? Another example is when lack of connection can actually increase barriers for young people. So in the presentation earlier that Dr. Musquash and his students participated in, they talked about Gladue Court and Gladue Principles, which is looking at alternatives to incarceration for our young people. So we have a lot of young people who come through our doors, and one profile might be a young First Nations who has relatively serious charges, unlikely to get diversion, very unstable, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so we sit around trying to figure out what the alternatives to incarceration might be for this young person. But this person might be from very far away, so they have no community, no connection to their community. They have no parents who might be available to care for them. There's no foster placements in the community. They have what many mainstream professionals call burned their other options for housing, which would be group homes. And so you have a young person who there are very few alternatives to incarceration. And therein, I think, lies a disproportionality of why some of our young people get harsher punishments, because it's the feeling that there is no other option for these young people. But there is a lot of hope, because through our collaboration, we found other ways to engage the community and to find ways forward for these young people. So our funder for this work, there we go, was the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. And we undertook a 2-year collaboration, which involved interviews with our Indigenous service providers who donated hours of time to talk to us and share their ideas with us. We did a design studio over 2 weekends.